In this video, we're going to look to create the pads that go with that old school jungle and drum and bass vibe and sound somewhat like this. So let's have a look at how we go about making this classic pad sound. As you can hear, there's a lot going on, and when each note triggers here, we're just sweeping up into the next sound. Now, the reason that works is because this is a sample. So how do we go about making that sample so we can do this effect? Here we go. So what I've done here is I've created 3 different layers. I'm going to go over how those layers all work together and how you'd go about making them. Now for today's video, we're just using sine waves, saw waves, some basic filters, and a little bit of unison. Let's have a listen to this as our first texture. And this is the body of the pad. Now the reason it works the way it does is because of unison, a little bit of detuning with another wave type, and that is pretty much it, believe it or not. What I'll do here is I'll go File and Initialize. Now what we're going to have is a saw wave that's being played over a chord. I think it's important at this point we have a look at how this chord works and the reason that I've chosen the notes that I have. Now I've kept everything in C here, so we're just using the white notes. And the chord I'm using here is a G major 7/9. You don't need to worry about the music theory side of it. Basically, white notes, skip every other note is going to be the easiest way to get around to this. And the reason it's a G is because we're leading here off of the G note. Now something you can do with this is lead it off of the C note, and it will always be a little bit easier to transpose down when you come to sample it because you're always going to operate from C. But if you're making your own chord in this kind of fashion, we know it's leading off of a G and it's a G chord, and we can tune it accordingly if we like. Here we go. To make this chord, it's very, very simple. So we're going to lead off our G here. We just skip every other white note here. And then we have our G7/9. Obviously it sounds horrendous and busy when it's just a saw wave being played over and over, but when we start to introduce our unison and our spread, that's where we get that kind of pad vibe coming from. So in Alchemy we can go into oscillator A here, and that's where we find our unison for oscillators. We've got number here and we can push that up, and we've got detune just here, and that's how detuned each voice is from the other one. And we're going to want to bring that back down a bit and then push it up again so we can find a nice tuning. So here we go, there's a bit of spread. And 4 voices gives us a nice wide spread there. But obviously 50% detune is just too much, so we want to dial that back. Somewhere around there, that's kind of nice, right? Today's video is sponsored by DistroKid. They let me get my music out to all of the major distributors, and they do that at a price an independent artist can easily afford. If you're ready to get your music or beats out there and want to release an unlimited amount of music each year, check the link in the description below for a discount off of your first year of unlimited distribution with DistroKid. Now it's a little bit harsh and big, especially for this kind of pad sound we're going for. I like to control it within the oscillator, but you can go to global and use the filter there if that's what you've got available in your synth. Alchemy allows me to have a filter on each oscillator, which is a lovely touch. I can switch this on just here and just dial it back. Pulling that back to where we find it to be quite a nice area. Now something else I did in my initial patch was I used this noise oscillator here. I added a bit of vinyl noise in. At the minute it's far too much and muddies everything up, doesn't it? If we use the low cut here and we take out, well, everything that we don't need, it doesn't muddy it up so much anymore. It just gives us a bit of crackle in the top end, and when we open up the cutoff it comes through a lot more. Perhaps too much, so maybe we'd bring it back to -9. What I found quite nice here was to have the cutoff open up quite harshly, and we can assign it to an AHDSR, an envelope essentially. When it's highlighted like this in Alchemy and it's blue, I can switch this on and link it to an envelope like so. This here would link it to ADSR1, which this already controls volume, so we want to make sure we create a new one. We're going to turn on sync, and we're going to give it a bit of an attack to bring it backwards, and we use our depth control here, and if you have a look at the cutoff, you'll see that it pulls back here. If you two are using Alchemy and you really want to learn more about all the amazing features that are in it, I have a complete masterclass on Alchemy, and I'll link that below for you. So now this envelope here will pull down the cutoff when we play our chord back. And depending on how we have our curvature, we'll either get the attack or we won't, or it'll be quite harsh. I quite like that for this use. Now to give this a bit of texture and body, I used the second oscillator, and we could just go with the saw wave again and lower it down by 12 semitones, which will bring it down one extra octave. Instead though, I utilised the complex waves that were in here. I think we went with big and dirty, which is kind of like a distorted sine wave. Applied a similar filter, just taking away that top end fuzz. That just helped thicken everything up. You could get a similar effect by using a sine wave and using the drive on your filter. I'm going to dial it back a bit in volume too. Now the other thing I made use of was in the effects, we switched this on and we just put a reverb over the entire thing. I used the convolution reverb and probably just the grand hall, but with a nice gentle mix amount. Bring the pre-delay right down. That gives us a pretty nice sound there, right? So let's have a look at the next layer sound and how that works with that initial body of the pad. Incredibly simple. We're using exactly the same chord. And all this is a sine wave set to arpeggiate. There's an arpeggiator built directly into Alchemy. If you're using another synth in, say, Logic, you could go over to MIDI effects and apply the arpeggiator from here, or use the arpeggiator in whichever door you are, or use the arpeggiator in your door. Every single door has an arpeggiator. If not, it's time to get a new door. And all this does is cycle through that scale at a really slow BPM. It's 1/4 on our BPM here of 170. And effects is just reverb again. I don't think we need much more explaining here. It's very, very simple. That's all it is, that arpeggiated sine wave. So the two sit together like this. And then we've got the ethereal choir. Here I've just used a choir patch and made essentially no changes. But what we have changed are our chords. We've split this down to just 2 notes. We're using the root G note, but an octave lower. And we're using a D note, which is part of the chord, up in the same octave. And that just adds in another texture. So all 3 layered together. That's it. So we've got that nice arpeggiator moving up and down. We've got the big built-out pad, and we've got that bit of a vocal texture in there, just for a bit of character, really. And bringing everything down an octave, we just like that kind of vocal texture in there. So what we do from here is we bounce this out as a single sample. We can just take these 3 channels here, solo them, hit Command and B, and bounce this out as a single sample. I like to leave the tail in, because if we do decide to ever just let it fade away as a sample, well, we have all that detail in there for us. So the reason we bounce it down to a sample is so we can emulate that old school jungle and drum and bass sound, where we'd likely have taken multiple synths and samples and crushed them all into one layer anyway. And it allows everything to pitch and ebb and flow all together. Let me show you what that means and how that works. When I bring it into Quick Sampler, now we start to be able to get that effect that we really have from the classic like jungle DnB pads. I've purposely kept this melody really simple. Again, it's just all within the white note, but it just moves up or down one note each time. And if we zoom in, you can see that each note overlaps the other one ever so slightly. And that's really important because that means this trigger happens while this note is still happening and being played. What that lets the sampler know is to move this sample down to this note instead of re-triggering it. Let me show you what I mean by that and how it sounds. At the moment, when we play this back, it's going to trigger the sample each time. Kind of works, but it's not exactly what we're after, is it? And the reason for that are two key things in here. If we look at amp and we have polyphony, we want to take our polyphony down to mono. Mono means it can only ever play the sample once at one key. So now when we play it back, they'll never overlap, but it does re-trigger. The second is glide here over in pitch, and this is the amount of time it will take for one note to go to the other. Instead of happening immediately at 0 milliseconds, we can give it a bit of glide and we get this effect. Now the reason everything sounds really different and kind of retextured each time is because we've got one sample that's being pitched down to different places. Remember I said before about you could make your chord so it always launches from C? Well, that would be your root key. Now we made one that launches from G, and the reason everything sounds a little bit off is our root key here is set to C3. Well, we want to set that to something slightly different, don't we? Perhaps G3. That's given us a really moody pad, hasn't it? Give it a longer glide time. So G2 is going to be our range. The other thing you may find is that the pitching up and down is an issue, and we've got our A and D here, so our attack and decay, and we can control how that performs too. We can also decide where the sample starts. Maybe we want it to start a little further up. We can use the slider just here and bring it to a different point. Let's give it an extra bit of texture by using a filter distortion, like we discussed in Alchemy, but now we're applying it to the sample and the collective whole thing. Let's change our filter to be a low pass creamy, which gives a nice distortion. Another nice touch we could do here is again, take some of that high end away with our filter. Let's utilize an LFO and give it a little bit of movement. So we've brought our cutoff back. We've got an LFO 1 here. We're going to press this button to sync it. 1/4 for the time being. And we need to set a target. And our target here is going to be filter cutoff. And then the slider is how much that's affected. And you can see Logic draws that in. I want this to be really subtle. And I definitely want to slow it down too, so maybe 1/2. If we bring our resonance up, we can get some effects out of this as well. very simple automation to fade that in. Something around there is kind of nice. Something that might only be available in Logic is you can switch this guy on here. It allows follow tempo, meaning it's going to try and sync this sample up to our track, but it gives us access to this speed option as well. And we can do things like halve the playback of the sample, but not change its octave. This gives us access to a whole new set of characters. We can speed it up as well. To a ridiculous degree if we like. Now we just add an amen and off we go. So that right there is it. We've got our different pad layers built over an amen break, nicely chopped up there. If you don't know how to chop up the amen break and get this kind of effect going at 170, watch this video next and I'll show you how we do jungle breaks in Logic Pro. See you in that one.